of experts, of subject matter experts that are lent to us by our member organizations. We have over 800 of such experts today. We are really, I'm extremely proud to say, a unique case in Europe and, to my knowledge, in the world. Thanks to the contributions of our member organizations, we are able to fund a variety of activities constantly, and we've actually been able to continue throughout the pandemic, actually increasing the number of activities. Our flagship event is our annual festival, which lasts 17 days. It takes place in autumn, from September to October. Of course, in this last year and this year, it will be virtual, and hosting hundreds of events presented by the Italian Society on Sustainable Development. We do an annual report on the progress of Italy, Europe, and the world on the SDGs. We annually also do an analysis of Italy's budget law, classifying it by SDG, and a lot of other activities throughout the years, mainly connected to statistical research, which I will show you in a second, and also institutional dialogue and dialogue with other key stakeholders of society, including other civil society organizations, companies, and so on and so forth. Now, briefly, I don't know how familiar you all are with the 2030 Agenda, but to make it very short, it is the second Global Development Agenda. Of course, the first was the Millennium Development Goals, approved in 2000. They expired in 2015, and that's when the 2030 Agenda was launched, to be completed, of course, as the name says, by 2030. This agenda, which was signed by 193 member states of the UN, is comprised of 17 SDGs, 17 Sustainable Development Goals, which you can see here, that cover more or less all aspects of sustainability. The important thing, there are two important things about the 2030 Agenda. The first is that it considers all aspects of sustainability, not just environmental ones, but also societal, economic, and institutional, to be on the same level of importance. And the second is that it did not call for their achievement just in development countries, which were the focus of the Millennium Development Goals, but also in developed countries, with a contribution not just of governments, but also the private sector, of civil society, and individual, making it really a global agenda, able to mobilitate everyone. As you can see, the focus, it was based on 4 pillars. It is based on 4 pillars: the economy, society, the environment, and institutions, and 3 principles: integration, universality, and participation. The motto of the 2030 Agenda is "Leave no one behind," and that is the overarching goal. Now, to achieve this agenda throughout the world, there is a need for really transformative action. This was clear in 2015. It is clear now, and it will be clear, I'm afraid, in 2030, when we will not have achieved all of the goals. But to say this, let's look at the European perspective, which is the one that is most familiar to all of us. Europe has always prided itself, and I say Europe meaning the EU, the 27 now countries of the EU, has always prided itself of being a world champion of sustainable development, of being the most advanced continent when it came to sustainability. And if you look at these graphs, these were created by us using data from Eurostat. These show the progress of all the European Union countries, and these, by the way, include also the United Kingdom, because Eurostat data before Brexit included, of course, also the UK. And it shows that overall, in between 2010 and 2019, which is just before COVID, the EU had done quite good progress in all of the SDGs. With the notable exception of SDG 15 that is on land environments. So the claim of the EU of being a world champion of sustainable development was apparently not misplaced. However, there are 2 key elements that raw data does not show. Going a little more in detail, if you can see, I know this is very difficult to read because it's small, but each vertical line, each green vertical line is a EU member state. The orange is the EU average, which is what you saw in the previous graph. And the blue is the position of Italy, because we have obviously focused on Italy. So, and of course, each of these refers to one of the SDGs. So SDG 1, SDG 2, SDG 3, SDG 4, and then there will be the others. There are massive differences in between the performance of individual countries. And I would add, within individual countries, within the regions, states, or whatever the local subdivision of individual countries is. So looking just at the national aggregate data is not enough to verify the claim of the EU as the most sustainable continent in the world, because it has large differences, large gaps in between the best performers and the worst performers. And there is a real variety in between them all. So they're not always what we could think of the usual suspects. The other key problem about this is that this data does not show how close the EU is to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. And the truth of the matter is, although there isn't enough data comprehensively at EU level, looking at the data of the single countries, the truth is that the EU will not achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, not those that concern developed countries at least. Sure, it will achieve the targets concerning primary education or those concerning malnutrition, but it will not achieve all of the goals by 2030 if it continues at this pace. And this is a pity, because the European Union from its beginning really had an important focus on sustainability that I think is somewhat underestimated. So if we go look at the Lisbon Treaty, here we're talking 6 years before the SDGs, before anybody thought of sustainability as a fashionable thing, if we can say. You can see, without going through all of them, that you can actually find the elements, the individual elements of sustainability within the Lisbon Treaty, which is at the base of the modern EU. In particular, point number 4 that refers to Article 4 of the Treaty of the Functioning of the European Union clearly states that the EU shall contribute to peace, security, the sustainable development of Earth, solidarity, mutual respect among peoples, and so on and so forth. Clearly referencing to an ambition of being sustainable. So the EU had a good basis, being one of the most advanced continents. It had a clear aspiration in its founding treaties, but it was not doing the right things to achieve the goals, neither at the continental, at the union level, nor within the single states. That is due to a variety of factors which are long, complicated, and boring, but you can sum them up by saying politics, essentially. Luckily, with the election of the new commission in 2019, and I'm sure you're all aware that it was a long and drawn-out process, the focus on sustainability was actually, sustainability really became one of the focus elements of this new commission led by Ursula von der Leyen. In the first place, and you can check this going at the commission's website, each individual commissioner was tasked with achieving these sustainable development goals in his or her area of responsibility, which is a quantum leap with respect to the previous commission. Furthermore, the von der Leyen Commission adopted what it calls a whole government approach concerning the Sustainable Development Goals, trying to bring together all the elements of its action. I would like to emphasize 2 elements, and these are the European semester, which is the main policy to evaluate and direct financing for member states, and this is being redrafted with the 2030 agenda as its key foundation by Commissioner Gentiloni, and the multi-annual financial framework, which again, very boring, but it's the real thing that matters for the EU because it's where the money is. And again, they want to take the Sustainable Development Goals as an element of this whole government approach. Here you can see also the Next Generation EU, but of course that's with COVID, so in a second. Furthermore, the Commission also stated that all of its priorities, the Green Deal, the economy that works for the people, the digital transition, the protection of the European way of life, and the promotion of democracy and liberal values throughout the world, can be attributed to the SDGs. Now, there has been criticism from civil society that this is more of a PR exercise than anything, but at least they have adopted the SDGs. Now, of course, as you all are aware, last year, when all of these mechanisms had to get in place, the Commission was inaugurated in December, so they were still finding their footing, COVID hit. And the very fact that we are talking all online is a testament of the impact that it has had on our lives and the lives of everyone in the continent. Without going into detail of each SDG in each country, we can say without reasonable doubt that it has had negative effects on almost all the SDGs and on sustainability in general. Even the small positive effects on the environment, which were caused by a reduction of emissions in last year during the lockdowns, has A, been abundantly covered, and B, in the sense that we now emit as much, if not more than before, and B, they have had a tremendous impact on all the social aspects of sustainability. And as I said in the beginning, the 2030 Agenda places all four aspects, the economy, the environment, society, and institutions on the same level. So you cannot sacrifice one to promote another. Now, Europe, and this boring presentation will be over, Europe has reacted well in what has been called by some as its Hamilton moment, referencing to Alexander Hamilton in the United States, by drafting the Next Generation EU, the 750 billion euro action plan. And although the 2030 Agenda is not explicitly referenced, key elements of it are included in the Next Generation EU and in what the National Recovery and Resilience plans that each country will have to be putting through by the end of this week to access that finance. In particular, I would like to highlight the fact that 37% of funds need to go for climate action, 20% need to go to digital transition, and 100% of all the funds need to respect the do no significant harm principle, so in respect of the environment, other than being in coherence with what the EU is doing at the social and economic level with other instruments, including especially the multi-annual financial framework. So the SDGs are considered at the heart of the process for the European Union for this next decade. They are a key element for rebuilding our societies in a better, more resilient and sustainable fashion. And they are being taken directly or indirectly by the European Union and by EU governments as a key framework. For example, in Italy, Italy's National Recovery and Resilience Plan will be published this week, but the drafts that have been circulated explicitly reference the 2030 Agenda. Now, the question we should ask ourselves is, and I exit the presentation. Yes, I exited the presentation. The question we should ask ourselves is this enough? And I would like to debate this with you. And is this too little, too late? And it's slightly different. Is it enough for what we want to achieve in general? And is it enough for what we want to achieve by 2030? And the 2030 element is fundamental because if we look at the past experience, within 4 years, 3-4 years, the UN will be starting to draft its next development agenda, which will be to 2045, 2050, who knows. So the SDGs, the 2030 agenda, will soon be yesterday's action plan, and everybody will be starting to focus on tomorrow's action plan. And that is one set of problems. The other set of problems is what we are doing enough to achieve a minimum level of recovery and resilience for our societies? And the answer to that is yes and no. Yes, because it's the first time at least in our lifetimes, that there has been a coherent effort to steer all of Europe towards a direction of increased sustainability, not just on the environmental side, but also on the social, economic, and institutional side. While this comes through mainly the management and implementation of funds, like the Next Generation EU, so while it's mainly through funding, it is also true that, and I'm sure you're more aware than me of this, that the EU's regulatory powers are also going towards this direction. And as you all know, that has a particular influence on national legislation and national regulation. So the EU is moving very slowly, but it is moving in the right direction. And the real question we should all ask ourselves, therefore, is if this will be enough. And that's really a question we do not have a yes or no, a definitive answer, but we can only hope that what is being done is enough. And we all have to act, we as civil society, you as individuals and members of civil society, we have to make sure that what is being done is not just words, but there's also action backing this, and that our ambition continues to raise. Activities such as those launched last Friday for Earth Day, for example, when every country and the EU announced or revised its ambition for climate action, are extremely inspiring and make us hopeful that we can achieve sustainability within, if not the framework that's determined by the 2030 agenda, at least within a framework that allows us to avoid irreparable damage to our planet. Am I still sharing my screen? No,
Not
okay,
anymore.
sorry. No, sorry, yes, I'm a professional. I've been only doing this way for a year, so I'm a professional. No, so that concludes my opening presentation. I don't know if there are questions in this, or if we can pass to the second part and start in debating what can be done by us and what should be done by governments to promote greater sustainability at the EU level and at the global level. Don't be shy.
I have a question. It's a pretty basic one though, but I'll just introduce it. Thank you for your presentation. I'm wondering, you showed us these slides with a lot of graphs on progress in a lot of different areas of the SDGs. Now, I know that these SDGs have their sub-objectives for each of them, so they sort of break it up. But a lot of these seem to me not to be super quantifiable. So I'm wondering how the progress in the SDGs is measured.
That's $1 million question. Yes, it's true. Many of the SDGs and many of the targets, of the 169 targets, of which 23 should have already been achieved, by the way, and have not, do not have quantifiable measures or are very vague. For example, one that concerns the people in this conversation directly, Target 8.6, says that countries should endeavor to significantly reduce youth unemployment, which is obviously very good, but significantly reduce can mean anything. Italy has over 2.5 million people aged 15 to 35 who are unemployed. So you could also reduce it by 1 million, but you will be left with 1.5 million young people unemployed. So it's difficult. Eurostat, however, does track enough of these elements that you can use, that we can achieve a reasonable interpretation of what is the aggregate progress for each SDG. So it's mix and match, using the targets, using the SDG indicators, and when there is not enough data, using what Eurostat or national statistical bureaus do. For example, in Italy, the National Statistical Institute has its own well-being indicators, or the Italians it's il BES, benessere ecosostenibile. And those allow us to track a whole variety of elements of sustainability. But yes, this is a problem. And in fact, one of the points in which civil society has been very insistent with the Commission has been that there has to be more and better data. But of course, that's very difficult also because if you start collecting data now, it will be valuable in 4 or 5 years when you have a time series that allows you to reference. So it's complicated. But yes, thank you very much for the question.
I wanted to ask what would your take be on how would you combine those 3 very different impact groups that, in my opinion, are mostly involved in sustainability? So civil society, governments, and also big corporations. Like those, you can never get all 3 of them to agree and work together. Like I'm sure it can't be all on the consumer. It's not all on companies. It's not all on governments. Well, how do you see this problem planning out?
That's again a very good question, and as I said, that's one of the innovative elements of the 2030 Agenda because it expects others than just governments to act. And the difficulty, there's no cookie cutter solution. There's not one solution that is good for all situations. But for example, what we do with our Sustainable Development Festival is we have companies as partners and sponsors, including some of the biggest companies in Italy. We have the ministries, the relevant ministries of the government. So for example, the Ministry of the Environment, but also the Ministry of Labor and so on and so forth. And we bring civil society and we try to find an agreement on certain elements that everybody agrees are on problems that everybody agrees are, yes, this is a problem we should focus on. So for example, when it comes to labor issues, there is an agreement on youth unemployment. Then, of course, there are different solutions. And the trick there is try to make sure that each actor acts to the best of their ability. So the governments act by providing a regulatory framework, by providing, depending on the situation, it can be stimulus, economic stimulus, by lowering taxes, by increasing taxes. It really depends on the situation. And companies, instead, what we have found, and we've been very surprised, has been that companies actually, be it because of noble intent, be it because they're afraid of what their shareholders will say, have been more active than governments, at least in Italy. Most companies are years ahead of the Italian government. And again, I'm sure that the main reason is that they saw where the wind was blowing, and so they said, let's hop on this sustainability business before the competition gets there. But I mean, we don't have to question motives. We have to evaluate outputs, and so this has been very good. And instead, coming to civil society, the best role for civil society is both to be an incubator of ideas and a watchdog that makes sure that government and companies do not do the wrong things. So, I mean, if we all think, for example, the Fridays for Future mobilization, you had and still will have millions of students, young teenagers, going on squares and demanding action on climate. And that obviously was a very powerful input. So what happened next? Companies started saying, well, let's try to tailor our products to meet their demands. And that generated a movement. And government said, well, perhaps if all of these future young voters are in the squares, we might have to take action to get towards them. And so that started a very slow process, as all these processes are, but it started a process that, I mean, has been ongoing and has seen our ambition for climate being revised in and becoming ever more ambitious. Will it be enough? Maybe not, but it certainly is a lot better than had there not been those protests against climate change. So again, not one solution for all, but it's always there are always ways to make the three elements work together.
Thank you. That was a very elaborate answer. Thank you so much.
I was wondering, how do you approach engaging with actors who mightn't necessarily have a vested interest in sustainability?
So, for example, companies or government. Well, first and foremost, it takes a lot of patience. So that's step number one. And the other step is trying to explain that actually we all have a vested interest in sustainability. And we all have a vested interest in sustainability because we are directly or indirectly affected by our achieving a greater or smaller sustainability. And ironically, this crisis from COVID has been a clear demonstration of that. The fact that our health systems were not built to be flexible and resilient for a major shock like this, the fact that our environments were degraded, and so in many cases, for example, in Italy, there are many studies that suggest that elevated mortality was due to increased exposure to pollution, and so on and so forth. COVID has shown that everything is connected, and you cannot just say, "Oh, it doesn't concern me. It doesn't matter. I'm not sustainable, and I don't care," because it will affect you. And on the other side, if you act to become more sustainable, it can actually become very advantageous. And this is true for the private sector, and it's also true for governments. So it takes a lot of patience, but it usually works. And also, if I may add, and this is something I've seen, if you talk to people about sustainability in general, they will say, "Oh yes, it's that stuff." If you then instead give concrete examples, for example, saying every year in Europe, X number of thousand people die due to pollution, people will start saying, "Well, that's something more relevant." Or if you say, "Look, there are X number of million people, young people who are unemployed," and so on and so forth, then people start thinking, and they usually realize that it's not just words, but it's actual concrete important things behind it.
I have a question, if I may. You've mentioned in your presentation, one of the reasons people are afraid that we are not going to meet the 2030 agenda was the new agenda for 2040 or 2050 will be set within the next 5 years. Could you elaborate how is that a bad thing? Because if, for example, we set an agenda for 2040, I am sure it's not going to be to worsen the situation we are in. Isn't it that it's going to be just a continuous for what we're already doing? Yes,
absolutely. But the problem is that if you move the goalposts, then people will procrastinate. That's the bottom line is that. I mean, if you start saying, well, there will be an agenda for 2040 or 2050, people will say, well, okay, fine. That means that we can reach even if we do not reach the goals by 2030, we'll have another 10, 20 years to achieve them. And that, of course, is not positive. Also, the other negative thing is that, unfortunately, most institutions and big companies do not have enough bandwidth, so to speak, to focus on multiple complicated things such as these. So if you give them the 2030 agenda as a reference point, they will understand it. If you start adding elements to that, they will either get confused or they'll say, no, let's just focus on one thing at a time. And in our experience, that is what happened with the Millennium Development Goals, and this, in our experience, is what we risk happening with the 2030 agenda. I will add, just to say, if we do not if we start acting on certain issues in 2025, it will be too late. So that's another element why being complacent and waiting until the last will not work.
That was very clear. Thank you. I do have a second question if no one needs to ask something. I was actually, my second question is going to be about Millennial Development Goals, because, well, obviously we did not reach all of the goals or to the level that the goals were set. And there was some reasons there's multiple reasons, I think, why we didn't do them, why we were not able to reach these goals. What was the reason that people did not learn from their older like the institutions did not learn from the mistakes they made in Millennium, and they applied like some solutions in for the SDG?
Well, I think one of the main issues there is that the Millennium Development Goals were, if you Google them and read them, they have an extreme focus on developing countries. I mean, number one is eradicate extreme poverty and hunger. Then there's another one on eliminating HIV/AIDS, another one on child mortality, maternal health, and so on and so forth. The focus was very clearly on developing countries, which was fine, obviously. But there wasn't a great understanding that the actions of the developing world, of the developed world, of Europe, America, and so on, could immensely affect the process at which and the rate at which developing countries achieved these goals. And so I think the main issue was that developed countries saw the Millennium Development Goals as a framework for the rest of the world. And while developing countries were saying, well, but why should we be the only ones to act when, as you're telling us, UN, it should be something that concerns the whole world? That having been said, although the Millennium Development Goals were not achieved, there was massive progress from them. I mean, the number of people living in absolute poverty since 2000 collapsed despite the 2008 economic crisis. Access to education increased throughout the world. I mean, it's true they were not achieved, but enormous progress was made. And before we have another question, I would take advantage of this question to introduce another element that I was saving for later, that has to do with COVID and the impact of what Europe or other developed countries can have for the rest of the world. As I'm sure you're all aware, a big issue with the vaccination campaign going on in Europe is A, the availability of doses, and B, the availability of doses for export. Now, the vast majority of vaccine inoculations done throughout the world have been in a limited number of countries: Europe, America, China, and a few others. And the UK, of course, although they're not part of the EU. With a disease like COVID, it's clear that we cannot just say, okay, we'll vaccinate ourselves and who cares of the rest of the world. We have a responsibility to the rest of the world. Not only a responsibility, but we have a vested interest. Why? Because the global supply chains, the global chains connected to the environment, and everything really is deeply interconnected. And so until COVID is over in all of the world, it won't be really over in any single country. All the restrictions we have, from masks to tests to limited travel to you name it, will continue until COVID is done. And so one big challenge now is to make governments understand that although it's understandable that they want to prioritize their own citizens for a variety of reasons, electoral concerns being perhaps the main one, it is also true that we must think actively and proactively about covering the entire world. Otherwise, we will not ever get out of this. And this is a key element, I think, of how we as, and I say we as Europe, influence the development, the sustainable development of the rest of the world. Because if we can ensure that the rest of the world can bounce forward, thanks to a vaccination campaign, thanks to aid, not just financial, we can ensure that the entire world will be in a much better place in 2030. If we do not, the best case scenario is that all countries will be able, after a long struggle, to get where they were before COVID. That means that they will have lost 1, 2, 3 years, and that will have massively negative effects on all of us. Countries that are battling COVID will not be taking the maximum attention on battling climate change, for example. Global supply chains with huge effects for the economy will continue to stagger. I don't know how aware you are, but there is a global shortage of microchips, and that is having immense effects on the production of everywhere products, from phones to washing machines, cars, and so on and so forth. And that, of course, will have a huge impact on our economies and on consumers. And you could go on ad infinitum with these, but we have not only a obligation, but also a vested interest in making sure that all of the world can recover and can recover in a sustainable way. So I took advantage of that question to give you this as an additional element of reflection, and it's not easy at all, but is something we should be really all working together to. So are there any other questions?
Well, not a question, but maybe is there some good news? Can we finish off with some positives?
I'm sorry, I'm laughing because we get asked that a lot. Yes, let us be positive, because on the one hand, there are various elements to be a bit more positive than we would have been a few years ago. And the first point is there's a massively increased awareness about the importance of sustainability, the effects of not being sustainable, not just to ourselves, but to the world, and the ability to communicate these information to the entire world. So that, of course, is a tremendous advantage. There's also an advantage, and it's connected to this, that we are able to adopt and share more sustainable practices today in a way that was unthinkable just a few years ago. I mean, just think of the fact that we're all meeting virtually this evening. And 10 years ago, 15 years ago, this would not have been possible. For one, there were not the technological platforms to do it. For another reason, we did not have access to enough internet broadband to do it. And this has been true not just for this event, but for a lot of people throughout the past 15 months that have been able to carry on their activities despite being forced to work from home. And while it is true for these activities, it's also true for a whole other variety of activities that have been able to continue despite lockdowns. Let's think of medical research and vaccine development and a whole host of similar elements that would not have been possible. And this is connected to the fact that technological innovation really is an extraordinary ally in our efforts to become more sustainable. It's let's call it a dangerous ally in the sense that it has to be used with caution, and technological innovation will have effects that are not necessarily positive, but it's a huge driver and a huge enabler, and that really should make us all a lot more confident about a better future. And finally, another element I would say is that historically, the younger generations have always been more, quote unquote, progressive than the previous generation. And this has been extraordinarily more true than the generation we belong to, and the future generation. That I believe we're all millennials in this call. Yes, no, we're not all. I still am a millennial, so I consider myself that. Okay, so because I was told that millennials are the not so young generation, but okay, whatever. But no, jokes aside, the younger generations, people under 30 today, are a lot more conscious and intend to live in a lot more conscious way than their parents and grandparents. This is true throughout the world. So really, I think this is an element that can make us hopeful for the future, because we will not just be talking about these issues, but we will be also acting coherently with the goals that we set, that countries set, and that we set for societies. So I think we can be positive, with always a grain of salt, knowing that we always have to act to improve and make sure that everybody else improves the situation in which we live. Although if I can share a very brief anecdote, our old boss that now has become the Italian Minister for Transportation was asked a very similar question a couple of years ago by a little school child. She might have been 4 or 5. And he looked at her, and the question was, "Well, do we have a hope for tomorrow?" And he looked at her and he said, "No." And we all froze and said, "Oh my God." Sorry. And he said, "No, we do not have a hope for tomorrow unless we all act to make sure that tomorrow will be a better world and a better place." So there is hope for tomorrow, but we do not have to be complacent. We have still some time, so if there are any other questions or reflections or ideas, feel free to share.
I do again, sorry. I was just wondering, with regards to the leave no one behind aspect, how do you promote like a unified response to the SDGs across different cultures, where say one culture or city might prioritize transport, a rural area mightn't, or even with different religions and all, without changing them fundamentally?
That's a very good question. And one of the key elements that are difficult in making people understand sustainability is that it is an integrated concept. It's not just a small element. And I must say, this has been one of the things I've observed, is that younger people have a more difficult time in understanding that it's not actually only environmental sustainability, but you also have the economy and societal and institutional aspects. But yes, obviously, people, institutions, and companies will be more focused on certain aspects. And that's absolutely fine, because everybody should do what they can within their areas of expertise and within their abilities. But the key point is that the 2030 Agenda and sustainability in general is not about changing one's view of the view the Weltanschauung, as the Germans would say, view of the world, but adopting certain behaviors that allow us to continue to live without impacting negatively on others. So the 2030 Agenda does not ask anybody to change their religion, for example, or not to travel, for example, or not to eat meat, for example. which are deeply personal and some would say also ethical issues. But it just tries to give a framework in which we can all live at the best of our abilities without reducing the ability of future generations to do the same. And so there should never be coercion, but there always should be encouragement explaining what the end goal is.
Thank you.
If I may, I have another question. Sorry for that. Regarding the impact of COVID-19 on the goals, in your opinion, is there still a chance that we can actually recover from it and we can meet the goals by 2030? And if yes, what we have to change and how can we increase the base on achieving these goals by 2030?
So COVID obviously has been and is a horrible crisis, but from a certain point of view, it's also a huge opportunity. It's a huge opportunity because it offers us the chance to reset all of a series of behaviors, all a series of activities that were fundamentally wrong for the achievement of the goals, but there wasn't enough political capital or interest in changing. And I'll give you a very simple example. Think of what the European Union has done with the Next Generation EU, or think of what Joe Biden is doing in America with his jobs plan, the $2 trillion economy intervention. Those actions for the crisis of 2008, 2009 would have been unthinkable. Those actions for the crisis we as Europeans saw in 2011 would have been unthinkable. Now, not only are they thinkable, but we are putting them into practice, but they are considered by a large segment of the population to be just the beginning. The majority of people are willing to say, okay, good, let's do more. And so this opportunity would allow us to fundamentally redraft the way in which our societies work, thanks, ironically, to COVID. So it's a huge opportunity. Will it be enough? That entirely depends on what we do. This is an opportunity that comes once in a lifetime. And so if we squander it, then no, we will not achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. If, however, we implement the necessary changes, then yes, we can either achieve them or get significantly closer to their achievement than we would have had COVID not taken place. And the whole point here is making sure that we are able to bounce forward and not to fall back on what we were doing before. And this is something every government really needs to do, and will have to continue to do in rebuilding our societies. And that's, I think, for us Europeans, the key element of the Next Generation EU.
Thank you.
Anyone else? It's a Sunday evening, so I can understand if nobody is...
I have a question. We have a topic who is talking about, we have an axe on monetary affairs. How do you think that monetary policy, and especially with some instruments who are growing in some local areas, the local complementary currencies, how do you think that especially Europe can deal with this kind of instruments in the monetary policy, because LCCs are, especially for some of them, sometimes against euro, against supranational currencies? How do you think these instruments are good, could be good, could have effects, even if no studies have shown that they have effects? Do you think they could have? And do you think it can be implemented in some monetary policies at national or European level?
That's a very interesting question. There's always a risk of negative effects of blowback from certain policies. So that, of course, always has to be taken into account. I would say if we see the next generation EU, you can see that there has been considerably little complaints against it because money is being given, and that's usually a huge incentive for people. And even the mandatory spending requirements, 37% on ecological transition, 20% in digital, and 100% respecting the do no harm principle, haven't really been criticized much because they are within a comprehensive package. So yes, there is certainly room, but like with all policies, they have to be taken with a certain care. Overall, there is no perfect solution, but certainly stating clearly what goals one wants to achieve and the time frame within which they have to be achieved is useful, if nothing else, to give, in this case, countries a useful framework in which to operate. So yes.
Thank you.
Okay, if no one has a question, I actually do have one. My question is not necessarily directly relating to the broader understanding of sustainability, but a couple of minutes ago, you mentioned the lack of microchip production. And I was wondering how that might impact sustainability, especially after the crisis.
Well, I'll give you a very simple example, staying in Europe. Volkswagen, which was involved in a pretty nasty scandal a few years ago about the emissions of their cars, has decided to become the largest electric vehicle producer in the world, aiming explicitly at taking over Tesla's position. Volkswagen has said, I don't remember if this week or the last, that they will not be able to produce as many vehicles as they want if they do not have the microchips. This is a very simple and simplistic example, but the global supply chains are interconnected, and any small break in the link causes enormous problems throughout the world. I'll give you another example. You're all aware of the boat that got blocked in Suez last month. Apparently, it was transporting, among other things, garden gnomes, the little figurines you put in your garden for decoration. And apparently, in the UK, there's a huge demand for these, and you cannot find them anymore. Now, that's silly and inconsequential, but imagine if it had been vital supplies for vaccines, for example. So there's always an interconnection, and if we have to accept that the world is, there is no place that is isolated for environmental issues, it's equally true for economic and social issues, and yes, also institutional issues. Now, the institutional aspect is the thorniest because there are some countries, not all countries agree on what the best institutional form is, so to speak. And that's one set of issues. But economic and social aspects, we can all agree that they have an impact. And so you can see huge effects on everyday life. And if you multiply them enough, they have huge effects also on sustainability. So it's again, something in which we have to understand that leave no one behind. It also means that no one can just race to the front without the rest of the world following in step.
Okay, yes, thank you so much.
We still have a few minutes, or else we can just end early, and as you prefer.
Do we have any other questions?
I have one question. Sorry for if you cannot see me, but I have a very bad connection, as my fellow orga knows. I just have a question reflecting a bit upon what kind of event we're doing right now. So sometimes it's very easy to associate digital formats with sustainability, but we do not always think behind what is behind, let's say, the digital format. So my question is mainly, do you think that the path of digitalization that we're following will lead to actually more sustainability, or are there also, let's say, negative and potentially very unsustainable aspects of digitalization and automatization?
Yes. Well, let's use this event as an example. As was said in the opening, you were hoping to meet all together in a venue in Milan. And of course, you didn't. So on the one hand, there was less travel, so less emissions. You did not have costs for travel because you're all connected from your homes. And so obviously those are positive elements from a sustainability point of view. However, you missed out on the social interaction that would have characterized these days. And that's equally obviously a negative aspect. How do those balance? It's, in this case, really very much up to all of you, but as individuals. But overall, there is obviously a trade-off. And in an ideal world, we should not have the trade-off. What we have seen, for example, we did our Sustainable Development Festival last September and October. And on the one hand, it was a huge success because we, thanks to doing everything in streaming, we had huge virtual audiences that we would never have had with physical events. And we were able to get speakers from throughout the world that otherwise would never have participated in person. On the other hand, we did not have all the interaction and one-to-one engagement that leads always to positive follow-ups, or you get to meet interesting people that have interesting ideas, or you allow people to meet and connect. And that obviously is a negative. And that is true for really everything we have been seeing in the past year of being connected to the world from our houses. So I do not think we'll go back to the world as it was before. But equally, I do not think that just being connected and waving at each other from our computers will be the only way forward. There will be some way in between, which will be more sustainable economically and environmentally, but will also allow that element of social interaction, which we have been sorely missing in the past year.
Thank you so much. Okay, if no one has other question, I have one other question which may be a bit specific though. So if it's too specific, feel free to disregard it. In the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, one goal that I think is often not talked too much about is a goal about peace and achieving peace as fast, let's say, as possible. And what I think is sometimes hard to understand is how related to sustainability the idea of conflict and war might be. So what I wanted to ask you is simply how important with respect to the other goals do you think this particular one is, and especially what is the trend in conflict and in peace building in these years, and do you think it will have let's say it's going better, or is it going worse, and how much impact does it have on the overall, let's say, sustainability of the other goals?
Yes, SDG 16 and SDG 17 are a bit unfortunate, quote unquote, because they're at the end of the list. They have a lot of things in them, and they're a bit more complicated to understand, perhaps. But no, it's absolutely fundamental. And in the first place, because institutional sustainability is one of the 4 pillars of the Sustainable Development Goals. So SDG 16 is a key element of that. And also because a lack of peace and a lack of stable and transparent institutions is a detriment to all the other elements of sustainability. And while war and conflicts are obviously the worst case scenario, you can get very negative effects also with, for example, high corruption, or with nepotism, or with non-democratic institutions. And unfortunately, we have plenty of those examples throughout the world. When it comes to conflicts, the overall consensus is that we have had an increase with respect to some years ago globally. Lower level conflicts, I mean, just today, if we think of it, we have a civil war going on in Yemen. We have war footing, not actual war, going on in between Ukraine and Russia. We have North Korea, you have China, and the neighboring countries. You have dozens of hotspots throughout the world, each of which could cause immense problems, not just to the countries that they take place in, but really to all of the world. So it is something we should be working on more. Unfortunately, that is perhaps the element in which civil society has the least influence, but that does not mean we should not act. For the Italian-speaking among you, I would like to point out that we published 2 days ago on our website an analysis of Pope Francis's encyclical, Fratelli Tutti, Brothers All, in light of SDG 16. So that may be, I will send you the link in chat. That may be something that you could be interested in. Unfortunately, it's only in Italian. But yes, no, SDG 16 is very important, and it should not be underestimated.
Perfect. Thank you so much. I'll wait for the link. Super interested.
Yep. If I can find chat, I said I'm a professional. I've been doing this. Oh God. No, if you have other questions, I can multitask up until that point.
Yeah, there's no hurry though. So no problem. Thank you.
I actually do have one more question. I believe you might have already answered slightly bit when Elisa first asked the question, but what do you generally think about internet being sustainable or not?
So I was reading a very interesting thing that Bitcoin mining had a higher energy consumption than Argentina, I believe. It was something like the 16th largest consumer of energy. So is that sustainable? No, it is not. There is also an interesting clip about Bitcoin of former ECB president and current Italian Prime Minister Mario Draghi, who very politely called Bitcoin not a currency and not something serious. So if you look for that on YouTube, it's very amusing. But no, on the one hand, the internet is a huge enabler for all of us. I mean, just think of the project that Facebook is doing with allowing children in Africa through satellites to have access to education. That would have been impossible 20 years ago. On the other hand, it's also true that the internet has some costs. It has some concerns because, of course, you always have the risk that the information that travels on the internet may be monopolized by malicious actors, be they state or non-state. You have all the issue concerning big companies and how they act with impunity, and that opens a whole other can of worms I do not want to go into. But so the internet, what we should not focus on is whether the internet is good or bad. The internet is, and it will continue to be. What we should do is try to think of ways in which to use it at best and mitigate the worst effects. So don't mind Bitcoin. No, I'm joking. Just FYI, I do not have a chat option. So unless I'm completely missing it,
then I will try to figure out why. It should be, you do not see it on the top right, right?
Nope. I have share, microphone, video, participants, raise hand, and that's it.
I believe if you've joined from a link, you don't have the option to post an okay. You learn a new thing every day. Well, if you go on ASviS.it, it's the first news on the website. So it's
perfect. I will look for it now and we'll send it on the chat so everyone can have a look.
Great, thank you.
I have another question, always concerning monetary affairs. Well, Christine Lagarde said when she arrived at the head of the ECB that she would like to see a change in the statutes of ECB to be more greener and to ensure that ECB can ensure more greener investments. Do you think it could be a framework to banks to enter in SDGs questions also if ECBs do it?
Yes, that's a very good question. Consider that the financial world has been adopting the ESG criteria, so environmental, social, and governance criteria, for a long time. And they have become the guiding line for increasing amounts of the financial world. That having been, and consider also that the ECB acts sometimes within the confines, it expands its mandate even without changing the statutes. Again, quoting Mario Draghi, I think you will all remember when he said that he would do whatever it takes. And a lot of people did not agree that he had the authority to say that, but he did. And that's how things went. And so whether or not the statutes will change, I do not know. What is interesting at the European level is the green taxonomy of investments, and which is basically a framework of what is considered to be a sustainable investment. And that will be for the private sector the holy grail of what is of investments for the next 5 to 10 years. There has been criticism. A lot of people say it's not green enough. There have been criticism by some member states because there are some activities that are included or others that are not included, namely coal, gas, natural gas, and nuclear power. But it's already a step ahead that was not conceivable 10 years ago. So that having been said, central banks, Christine Lagarde is one, but also the former governor of the Bank of England and the Federal Reserve in America have all been saying that climate change is a risk they have to factor in their evaluations of how to act. within their mandate. So again, I think that central banks not having to answer to voters have the ability to be a lot more progressive in sometimes than certain governments, with all the limitations that central banks have, of course.
Thank you.
We are now officially in overtime, so.
Yes, thank you so much. Do we have any other questions? Just to have a one last check? No? Then thank you so much, Andrea, for joining us today. Let's just all go back to the main room in the general part of the team, and we can all have a small wrap up and then have our bye-bye time.
Thank you, Andrea, for all your answers. It was really helpful.
It was really a pleasure for me. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I also just wanted to remind that ASviS provided us with beautiful courses on sustainable development goals. So you've all received your credentials, and I'm sure many of you have already watched it. But just as a reminder, and thanks to Andrea and ASviS for the opportunity. Thank you so much.
Our pleasure. Our pleasure. Thank you.
Amazing. Yes. Then let's go back to the main room altogether.
Hey, Linus. The call is over, so we can join the general call again.